In Mark 121, we're going to meet a new kind of dative. Other than that, it's pretty straightforward. Kai eis poruantai eis Capernaum, kai euthus toi sabasin eis elthon, eis tein synagogein et didasken. And going into, so there's your compound verb, right? Into Capernaum. And I think we talked about this earlier, but this repetition of the preposition is considered a good style Greek. And immediately, okay, here's your thing. Does euthus contain the idea of very first thing that he did, or was it, and the next thing he did after he entered into Capernaum? In other words, is there a sense of urgency in euthus? I would guess it just means, and the first thing that he did, toi sabasin. Okay, this is called a dative of time. I like to call it the dative of time when. When Greeks want to say when something happens, they put it into the dative. So immediately, and in English we would say on the Sabbath, then you have your aorist participle, again with this repeated preposition, but there's your compound, right? Elth. So, and he entered into the synagogue. Then you have this imperfect, right, from didasko. So you have to decide what kind of imperfect that is, because just to say he entered into the synagogue was teaching. Well, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Why would it be an imperfect? Probably this is an example of what we saw earlier in Mark, that this is an inceptive or ingressive imperfect, and he began to teach. And if you look at the different translations, you can see that most of them went with the inceptive idea. The NASB says began to teach and puts it in italics, which is typical for them. ESV, he entered the synagogue and was teaching, so the straight imperfect. NRSV, he taught, kind of interesting translation. CSB, he began to teach. NIV began to teach. Net Bible began to teach. NLT began to teach. So to phrase this, you have your conjunction with the kai. I'm going to put it on its own line. And they went into Capernaum, and immediately, here's your dative phrase, on the Sabbath entering, maybe I'll put entering on its own line. What did they enter into? They entered in the synagogue, and what did they do? They started teaching. So you have two verbs here, right? You have they went into Capernaum, and he was teaching. So we'll indent the conjunction. They went into the synagogue, and immediately on the Sabbath, we'll probably have to come back to adjust that, entering into the synagogue, he began teaching. So he began teaching. When did he begin teaching? Now here you got to be careful not to line the dative up with these conjunctions. So I'm going to put it here. On the Sabbath, entering into the synagogue. And you remember, I hope, I'm sure you do, that what you have in Greek is, in order to indicate sequence, you have an aorist participle followed by the main verb. So since that's what eis elthon is doing, you can probably translate it as an indicative, which is how we would do it. So, and they went into Capernaum, and right away on the Sabbath, entering into the synagogue, he was teaching. Oh, by the way, I should point out that you notice this is singular because it's Jesus and not the disciples that he's talking about. I'm no doubt the disciples went in with him, but that's not the point that Mark is making.